She didn't mean to call him. The phone was a jagged weight in her pocket as Edward's fingers dug into her shoulder like iron talons. Gloria Stewart's breath came in ragged, shallow hitches, her light blue shirt torn at the shoulder, her left eye pulsing with the heat of a fresh bruise. The gravel of the driveway bit into her heels as he dragged her toward the idling car. "Please, Edward, stop," she whimpered, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the engine. Inside her pocket, the cracked screen of her smartphone woke up, a frantic thumb press against the emergency dial accidentally swiping a name at the top of a list she didn't remember adding. On the other side of the city, in the back of a silent luxury sedan, Jae-Hyuk stared at his vibrating phone. He didn't recognize the number, but he recognized the sound immediately. The wet slap of a blow, a woman's stifled cry, and the arrogant snarl of a man who thought he was untouchable. Jae-Hyuk's obsidian eyes didn't flicker. He simply adjusted his camel coat. "Don't move," he murmured into the line, his voice a chilling anchor in Gloria's sea of chaos. "I'm coming." The driveway was a blur of gray concrete and the suffocating scent of Edward's expensive cologne, a smell that used to mean safety but now signaled only the coming of a storm. Gloria's heels scraped against the ground, the sound of leather dragging over stone, echoing like a death knell in the quiet suburban street. "Edward, please," she gasped, her voice thinning into a threat of pure terror. "People are watching. Just stop." "Let them watch," he spat, his fingers tightening on her shoulder with a strength that made the bone groan beneath her light blue shirt. His grip was absolute, a predator reclaiming a runaway prize. "They'll see a concerned husband taking his hysterical wife inside." "You're making a scene, Gloria. You always have to make it so difficult." Her left eye was a blooming map of heat and pain, the swelling already beginning to narrow her field of vision. Every time her feet stumbled, he yanked her upward, her arm straining in its socket. In the frantic chaos of her mind, she felt the hard, rectangular weight of her smartphone in her pocket. It was a lifeline she couldn't reach, a piece of glass and plastic that felt miles away. As Edward shoved her against the side of his black SUV, the impact jarred her entire frame. Her hip hit the door handle, and for a split second, the pressure of his body pinning her against the metal forced her hand deep into her pocket. Her fingers, slick with the sweat of panic attack, brushed the screen. She didn't have time to look. She didn't have time to unlock it. She only felt the haptic vibration of a long press, the shortcut she'd set for emergencies, or perhaps just a fluke of a shattered screen reacting to the friction of her struggle. "You think you're going somewhere?" Edward leaned in, his face inches from hers, his eyes dark with a chilling, possessive rage. "You belong in that house. You belong to me. If I have to lock every door and nail the windows shut to make you remember that, I will." He grabbed her hair, forcing her head back to look at the house she now viewed as a tomb. Gloria's thumb pressed desperately against the phone in her pocket, swiping blindly at the screen as she heard the faint, ghostly bloop of a call connecting. She didn't know who she was calling. She prayed for her sister, for the police, for anyone who could hear the sound of her soul breaking. "Please." She screamed, not just at Edward, but into the hidden microphone of the phone pressed against her thigh. "He's hurting me. Edward, you're hurting me. 42 Oak Creek. He's taking me inside. Help." Edward's hand clamped over her mouth, tasting of salt and leather. "Shut up." He hissed the words into her ear. He didn't notice the faint glow emitting from the fabric of her pocket. On the other end of the line, miles away in a world built on silence and steel, the call was being received. Jae-Hyuk sat in the rear of a moving Bentley, the city lights of Seoul-on-the-Hudson flickering across his sharp, angular features like a silent film. He had been reviewing a ledger of debts, his face a mask of bored, elegant cruelty, when his private phone buzzed, a number known only to a handful of men who feared him. He picked it up without looking. He expected a report on a shipping heist or a political bribe. Instead, he heard the raw, jagged sound of a woman's terror. He heard the scrape of gravel, the heavy, rhythmic thud of a struggle, and then a voice he hadn't heard in person for 5 years, but had replayed in his mind every night since he'd first seen her standing at a podium, brilliant and untouched by the world's filth. "Please, he's hurting me." The ledger in Jae-Hyuk's hand didn't just close. It crumpled under the sudden, violent tension in his grip. His breathing stayed slow, but his eyes, once bored, turned into something predatory and ancient. He recognized the address. He had known her address for years, a piece of information he kept like a forbidden relic. "Gloria," he whispered, the name a dark prayer. Beside him, his lead security detail noticed a change in the air, the sudden drop in temperature that happened only when Jae-Hyuk was contemplating an execution. On the line, Edward's voice came through, muffled but distinct. "Nobody is coming for you. Gloria, you're mine." Jae-Hyuk didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply tapped the speakerphone and spoke into the chaos of Gloria's pocket, his voice a cool, obsidian blade that seemed to cut right through the distance. "Don't move," Jae-Hyuk murmured, his gaze fixed on the back of his driver's head. "I'm coming, and I'm bringing hell with me." He disconnected the call and looked at his driver, the Sharp residence. "Break every traffic law we have. If the car is still in one piece when we arrive, you weren't driving fast enough." As the Bentley roared into a lethal U-turn, Jae-Hyuk adjusted his camel coat and pulled a silver-handled knife from his inner pocket. The stranger Gloria had dialed wasn't a savior. He was a storm, and he'd been waiting 5 years for an invitation to make her his. The black SUV surged forward, the tires screaming against the asphalt as Edward slammed the vehicle into gear. Inside, Gloria was a mess of tangled limbs and silent sobs, her head pressed against the cold glass of the passenger window. Edward's hand was a permanent fixture on the back of her neck, his knuckles white as he steered with a singular, manic focus. He was talking, a low, rhythmic drone about fresh starts and learning her place, but Gloria couldn't hear him over the blood rushing in her ears. The suburban landscape began to blur into a streak of green and beige, the safety of the neighborhood receding. But as they reached the intersection that led to the main highway, the world suddenly shifted. A silver Bentley, appearing like a ghost from a side street, didn't slow down. It didn't signal. It moved with the predatory grace of a shark, cutting across 3 lanes of traffic to nose directly into the SUV's path. Edward slammed on the brakes, the seatbelts locking with a violent jerk that sent a spike of white-hot pain through Gloria's bruised ribs. "What the hell is this?" Edward roared, reaching for the horn. Before he could touch it, 2 blacked-out SUVs swerved from behind, box-pinning Edward's vehicle against the concrete divider. It was a maneuver of surgical precision, executed with the kind of practiced coldness that suggested this wasn't a road rage incident. It was a harvest. The door to the Bentley opened. Jae-Hyuk stepped out into the afternoon sun, a figure of terrifying composure amidst the screeching metal and rising smoke. His camel coat caught the breeze, and for a moment, the world seemed to go silent. He didn't look at the chaos. He didn't look at the traffic beginning to pile up behind them. His eyes were fixed entirely on the passenger side of the SUV, where Gloria's pale, tear-streaked face was visible through the glass. Edward reached into the glove box, fumbling for the firearm he kept there. "I'm a federal officer," he screamed through the windshield. "Get back, or I'll open fire." Jae-Hyuk didn't flinch. He didn't even slow his pace. He raised a hand, a slight gesture of 2 fingers, and the passenger window of the SUV didn't just break. It vanished. One of Jae-Hyuk's men had moved with the speed of a shadow, shattering the reinforced glass with a tactical baton in a single, deafening strike. The sudden rush of air brought the scent of expensive tobacco and ozone into the car. Before Edward could level his weapon, the door was ripped off its hinges. Jae-Hyuk reached inside, his movements a blur of cold beauty. He didn't grab Gloria with the frantic desperation Edward had. He moved like a man retrieving a priceless violin from a burning building. His hand found Gloria's waist, pulling her out of the wreckage and into the open air. As she felt the solid, steady warmth of his chest, she saw the absolute violence begin. Edward tried to lung across the center console, but he was met with the heavy boot of one of Jae-Hyuk's guards. He was dragged out of the driver's side and slammed onto the hood of his own car. The sound of his face hitting the metal was a dull, sickening thud. Jae-Hyuk didn't look away from Gloria. He shielded her eyes with one hand, pressing her face into the soft wool of his coat. But she could still hear it. She heard the wet snap of bone, the poetic echo of the way Edward had handled her. She heard her husband's arrogant voice turn into a high-pitched, gurgling plea for mercy. "You like to break things that don't belong to you, Jae-Hyuk's voice was a low, melodic vibration that Gloria felt in her own spine. He wasn't shouting. He was conversing with a dying man. "But you made a mistake. Edward, you touched my masterpiece with filthy hands." There was another sharp crack, a cry of agony, and then silence. Jae-Hyuk stepped back, turning Gloria away from the broken man on the pavement. He lifted her chin with a gloved thumb, forcing her to look into eyes that were darker than the midnight sea. There was no pity in them, only an intense, burning possessiveness that made her heart stutter. "You're safe now, Gloria," he whispered, his thumb brushing just below her bruised eye with a tenderness that felt more dangerous than the violence he'd just unleashed. "But the world you knew is gone. You belong to the shadows now." He didn't wait for her to answer. He lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the Bentley, leaving the wreckage and the ruined man behind like yesterday's trash. As the car door closed, sealing them into a tomb of leather and silence, Gloria realized the stranger hadn't just rescued her. He had claimed her. The transition from the world of violence to the world of silence was absolute. When Gloria's eyes finally fluttered open, there was no sound of screaming tires or the sickening crunch of bone. Instead, there was only the hum of a climate-controlled room and a faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and cold rain. She was lying in a bed so vast it felt like an island, draped in sheets of charcoal silk that felt like water against her skin. Her light blue shirt had been replaced with a heavy, cream-colored silk robe. As she tried to sit up, a sharp hiss escaped her lips. The bruise on her eye had tightened, and her ribs throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. The room was not a room so much as an observation deck. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls looked out over a sprawling, glittering metropolis that felt miles below. The city lights flickered like dying embers, making her realize she was perched in a palace in the sky, far above the reach of ordinary men, and certainly out of the reach of Edward. "You're awake." The voice was a low, melodic vibration that seemed to come from the shadows near the window. Gloria gasped, pulling the silk duvet to her chest as her heart hammered against her bruised ribs. Jae-Hyuk stepped into the soft glow of the recessed lighting. He had discarded his camel coat and black turtleneck, now wearing a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the dark, intricate ink of tattoos that spiraled like smoke toward his wrists. He held a crystal glass of amber liquid, his obsidian eyes tracking her every movement with a terrifying, predatory stillness. "Where am I?" Gloria's voice was a raspy ghost of itself. "Where's Edward?" Jae-Hyuk took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving her face. "You are in the only place in this city where his badge means nothing. As for your husband, he is being processed. He will not be bothering you again, Gloria. Not tonight. Not ever." The way he said process made a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She looked around the room. The minimalist marble, the priceless art, the sheer cold height of it all. It was beautiful, but it was sterile. It felt like a vault. "Who are you?" she whispered, the question she should have asked the moment she heard his voice on the phone. "Why did you come for me?" Jae-Hyuk walked toward the bed, his movements fluid and silent. He didn't stop until he was standing directly over her, his shadow stretching across the silk sheets like a shroud. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her bruised temple. For a moment, she expected him to strike her, to show the same jagged rage Edward had. Instead, his touch was feather-light, almost reverent. "I am the man you called," he said simply, "and I came because I've been waiting 5 years for a reason to take you out of that house." He walked over to a sleek console and pressed a button. A hidden television screen flickered to life, showing a news report on mute. The headline scrolling across the bottom made Gloria's breath hitch. Investigation into federal officer Edward Sharp following alleged ties to organized crime. Below the text was a photo of Edward, but it wasn't the man she knew. He looked small, broken, and terrified. Then, the image shifted to a silhouette of the man standing in front of her. The news didn't use Jae-Hyuk's name. They referred to him only as the architect of the underground. They spoke of him in hushed tones, a ghost who pulled the strings of the city's heart. A man whose name was synonymous with violence, so precise it was considered an art form. Gloria looked from the screen back to Jae-Hyuk. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't been rescued by a hero. She had been plucked from the jaws of a wolf by something much larger, much older, and infinitely more dangerous. "You're him," she breathed, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "The one they talk about in the papers. The one who doesn't leave witnesses." Jae-Hyuk set his glass down on the nightstand with a soft clink. He leaned over her, his face inches from hers, the scent of sandalwood now overwhelming. "The world has many names for me, Gloria. To them, I am a monster. To you—" He paused, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a possessive heat. "To you, I am whatever you need me to be. But make no mistake, you are not a guest here." He straightened up, his silhouette framed by the infinite city lights behind him. "This is your sanctuary, and it is your prison. You will have the best doctors, the finest clothes, and the absolute protection of my name. But you will not leave the sky, Gloria. Not until I say so." He turned to leave, his white shirt gleaming in the dark. "I'm just a collection to you," she called out, her voice trembling with a spark of her old fire. "Another piece of art for your wall." Jae-Hyuk paused at the door, his profile sharp against the light. "You are my masterpiece, Gloria, and I don't let anyone touch what is mine." The door clicked shut with a sound of finality, leaving Gloria alone in the silence of her gilded cage, watching the world she used to know burn in the lights below. The days that followed were a blur of soft silk, clinical precision, and the terrifying, omnipresent shadow of Jae-Hyuk. Gloria was not a prisoner in the traditional sense. There were no chains, no locks on her bedroom door, but the vast, glass-wall perimeter of the penthouse was a border she dared not cross. Outside, the world continued in its frantic, noisy pace, while inside her life had been reduced to a carefully curated stillness. On the fourth day, the silence in the penthouse was interrupted by a low, melodic chime. Jae-Hyuk stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the sunset bleed crimson across the skyline. He didn't turn when Gloria entered, though his reflection in the glass tracked her approach with unnerving focus. "You look better," he noted, his voice smooth as polished stone. "The swelling in your face has gone down. You're almost back to the woman I first saw." Gloria stopped a few feet behind him, her hands trembling slightly as they brushed against the silk of her robe. "I'm not a woman, Jae-Hyuk. I'm a project. That's what you meant, isn't it? When you call me your masterpiece." He finally turned, his posture relaxed, his eyes unreadable. He gestured toward a mahogany desk in the corner of the room. It was covered with objects that stopped the air in Gloria's lungs. There were the charred remnants of her undergraduate thesis, the one Edward had burned in a fit of rage 2 years ago. There was the delicate, silver-plated music box her mother had given her, the one she thought had been destroyed during their last move. And there, sitting on a velvet stand, was a framed photograph of her, not a glamour shot, but candid, blurred image of her sitting in a park, reading, 5 years ago. Gloria walked toward the desk, her fingers hovering over the artifacts of a life she thought she'd lost. "How?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "These were destroyed. Edward, he made sure of it. Edward broke things because he couldn't stand the idea of you having an identity outside of his reach," Jae-Hyuk said, walking slowly toward her. "He sought to erase you because he was terrified of who you could be without his shadow. I, on the other hand, am a collector of things that deserve to be preserved." He stood behind her, his presence an immovable wall of heat. "I saw you at your thesis defense 5 years ago. You were wearing a blue dress, much like the one you had on when I found you. You spoke about architecture, about the strength of foundations. I remember thinking that the world was far too cruel for someone with a mind as precise as yours." Gloria turned to face him, the weight of his obsession settling over her like a heavy velvet coat. "You were watching me? For 5 years. I was waiting," he corrected softly. "I knew that a man like Edward Sharp would eventually push you to the brink. I knew he was a man of small, pathetic outbursts who would eventually make the mistake of breaking something truly beautiful." He reached out and picked up the music box, winding the key. A tinkling, melancholic melody filled the room. The same song she played on her phone the night she first realized she had to leave. "You didn't just save me," she realized, the horror and the attraction of the situation warring in her chest. "You were waiting for me to be broken so you could sweep in and piece me back together exactly how you wanted." Jae-Hyuk's expression remained calm, but his eyes flared with sudden, intense heat that made her heart race. I didn't break you, Gloria. I simply ensured that I would be the one to hold the pieces. You were a masterpiece waiting to be rescued from a vandal. Now, you are in a place where nothing can ever reach you again unless I permit it. He stepped closer, his hand tracing the line of her throat, his thumb resting against a frantic pulse point there. Edward wanted you small, silent, and forgotten. I want you to be the woman I saw 5 years ago, sharp, brilliant, and untouchable. I have restored what he destroyed because I am the only one who truly sees what you are worth. Gloria looked at the burnt, rescued remains of her life, and then back at the man who had laid them out like trophies. She felt a strange, cold clarity settling in. She wasn't free, but for the first time in years, she wasn't being diminished. She was being curated. And as Jae-Hyuk looked at her with that terrifying, singular focus, she realized that to survive this, she would have to stop being the broken girl who needed rescuing and start being the woman he had spent 5 years obsessed with finding. The penthouse transformed at night. During the day, it was a sanctuary of light and polished marble, but as the sun dipped below the skyline, the space bled into something sharper, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Gloria found herself drawn to the study, a room she usually avoided, by the low, rhythmic hum of voices that didn't sound like ordinary conversation. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. She didn't mean to intrude, but a name caught her, her own. She pressed herself against the cold wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. Inside, the room was bathed in the blue glow of 4 wall-sized monitors. Jae-Hyuk was seated behind a desk that looked carved from obsidian. He wasn't alone. 2 men in dark, razor-sharp suits stood before him, their heads bowed as if they were in the presence of deity. Jae-Hyuk held a stylus, his hand moving with the elegant, dismissive grace of an artist sketching a final draft. The police department is still cleaning up the mess at the intersection, one of the men said, his voice devoid of emotion. Edward Sharp's partners are asking questions. They're claiming it was a targeted ambush, not a standard kidnapping. Jae-Hyuk didn't look up from the screens, where maps of the city were layered with encrypted data streams. Let them ask. By the time they tracked the vehicle's origins, the paper trail will have ended in a landfill in the outskirts of the province. See to it that Sharp's records are scrubbed. If there's a single digital footprint linking him to Gloria Stewart, I want it incinerated. And the family, sir? The brothers. Jae-Hyuk's hand stopped. He looked up, and the cold precision in his eyes made Gloria's blood run cold. It wasn't a look of a man protecting his own. It was the look of a man who owned the board and was merely moving his pawns into place. Leave them. They are to be monitored, not interfered with. If they become a liability, they are to be brought to me, not harmed, not touched, just secured. He tapped a key, and a live feed appeared on the screen. It was a view of a warehouse district, then a high-end restaurant, then a bank lobby, all locations where the lifeblood of the city's economy flowed. He tapped again, and financial ledgers flickered by at a speed that would have made a banker weep. This wasn't a criminal enterprise. It was a shadow government. He operated with a terrifying efficiency, dismantling reputations and rerouting wealth with the same detachment one might use to rearrange furniture. The city is a fragile ecosystem, Jae-Hyuk continued, his voice a soft, melodic monotone. And most men are too clumsy to understand the delicate balance. They believe power is measured in gunfire. They are wrong. Power is measured in the ability to make a man disappear without anyone noticing he was ever here. Gloria leaned forward, her gaze snagged on the screens. She saw the sheer scope of his influence, the way he steered local politics, the way he muffled scandals, the way he orchestrated the very reality of the city from his glass-walled eyrie. He was the architect of everything. Her abduction, the sudden dismantling of Edward's life, the silence that now cloaked her existence. It wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a tactical adjustment in his broader design. She realized then that Jae-Hyuk didn't just inhabit the shadows. He was the darkness that gave the city its shape. There was no chaos here, only a terrifying, calculated order. And she, in her light blue silk robe, was not just his obsession. She was a variable he had carefully integrated into his perfect ruthless equation. A floorboard creaked beneath her. The voices in the room stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and suffocating. Gloria's breath hitched, and she stepped back, ready to run, but the door handle turned with a smooth, silent rotation. Jae-Hyuk stood in the threshold, his white shirt glowing against the dim room. The men in suits were gone, vanished like smoke. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, as if she were a child who had stumbled upon something too sharp for her hands. "Curiosity, Gloria," he said, stepping into the hall to block her retreat, "is a dangerous trait in a world you are only just beginning to understand." He didn't grab her. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held the door open, a silent invitation that felt more like a command. If you want to understand the machinery of your life, you need only ask. But be warned. Once you see how the empire is built, you can never go back to believing the world is a simple place. He stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood enveloping her, and his eyes searched hers with an intensity that promised both ruin and absolute, terrifying clarity. "Are you ready to see everything, Gloria? Or do you want to retreat to the cage?" The silence of the penthouse had become a pressurized chamber, but the real threat wasn't the glass walls. It was the digital ghost of the man she had escaped. 3 weeks after her rescue, the serenity of the Sky Palace was shattered by a notification that flickered across the wall-mounted screen. Edward had gone public, but not in the way Jae-Hyuk had anticipated. He wasn't using the law. He was using the past. Gloria stood before the massive display, her reflection pale and ghostly against the backdrop of a video feed. Edward was sitting at a kitchen table that looked agonizingly familiar. He looked disheveled, a bandage wrapped around his arm where Jae-Hyuk's men had left their mark, but his eyes were fueled by a manic, desperate fire. He was holding up a stack of old journals, Gloria's private thoughts from her years as an architecture student, long before she met him, long before the walls of her life began to shrink. "Gloria," he said, his voice cracking with performance of sorrow that made her stomach churn. "I know you're listening. I know who took you, and I know you think you're safe." He reached out and tapped a file on the screen. It was a digital copy of her parents' gravesite location, a private, quiet place in the suburbs. "I'm not a bad man, Gloria. I just made a mistake. But if you don't come back, if you don't walk through those front doors by midnight tonight, I'm going to make sure that everyone who ever loved you feels exactly what I'm feeling right now. I'm going to unearth every secret, every shame, every moment of your life that you tried to bury." He wasn't just threatening her. He was erasing the last vestiges of her identity. He was weaponizing her history to flush her out, using the sanctity of her family and the privacy of her dreams as bait. Gloria felt a tremor start in her fingertips, a cold, creeping sensation that reached into her chest. She had spent weeks trying to reconcile her survival with the reality of Jae-Hyuk's shadow empire, but this was different. This was Edward reaching through the glass, through the security, through the power of a Mafia boss, and grabbing her by the throat. Jae-Hyuk entered the room, his footsteps silent on the marble. He stopped behind her, his presence a calm anchor. He watched the video, his expression unchanging, but the air in the room grew heavy, charged with the static of an impending storm. "He's destroying everything," Gloria whispered, her voice tight. "He's going to desecrate their graves. He's going to leak my journals. He wants me to crawl back, and he knows that if I don't, there won't be anything left of me to save." She turned to Jae-Hyuk, her eyes brimming with a mix of fury and despair. "You can kill him, can't you? You can make him disappear like you made his records disappear." "I can," Jae-Hyuk said, his voice devoid of heat. "But that won't stop the spread of what he has already set in motion. If I silence him now, the files go public. He has automated the destruction of your reputation. He has ensured his own life with your suffering." Gloria walked to the window, staring down at the city. The emotional breaking point she had avoided for weeks finally arrived. It wasn't the fear of Edward's fist anymore. It was the realization that she was still a chess piece being moved across a board. She had been a victim to Edward's control, and now she was a prize in Jae-Hyuk's collection. "I won't let him do it," she said, her voice turning hard, crystalline. "I won't let him burn my life because he can't stand that I escaped." Jae-Hyuk stepped into her line of sight, his obsidian eyes searching her face. He saw the shift. The moment the grief hardened into something jagged and sharp. "And what would you do, Gloria?" "You cannot walk into his house." "I don't need to walk into his house," she replied, looking at it with a gaze that mirrored his own cold precision. "I need you to show me how to fight back. Not as your masterpiece, and not as his victim. Show me how to be the person who makes him disappear." Jae-Hyuk remained silent for a long moment, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips, a look of genuine, terrifying approval. He realized then that she was no longer asking for protection. She was asking for the weapon. "Very well," he said, stepping aside to reveal the door to the training room she had been barred from entering. "If you want to survive this, Gloria, you must stop fearing the monster and become the nightmare he created." The training room was a cavern of polished concrete and aggressive silence, a stark contrast to the plush velvet and marble of the penthouse upstairs. It smelled of industrial cleaner and the metallic tang of sweat. Gloria stood in the center of a rubberized mat, her breath hitching in her chest as Jae-Hyuk circled her. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. His sleeves were rolled high, revealing the taut muscles of his forearms and the shifting, intricate ink of his tattoos. He reached into a wooden case and tossed a small, weighted practice knife toward her. She scrambled to catch it, the heavy handle biting into her palm. It felt colder and more substantial than any kitchen utensil she had ever held. "You've spent your life being handled by men who want to break you," Jae-Hyuk said, his voice a low, steady cadence that seemed to fill the room. "You were taught that intimacy meant vulnerability, that a touch was always a precursor to pain. That ends now." He stepped into her personal space, his shadow engulfing her. "A gun is an insult. It is a loud, vulgar way to end a conversation. But a blade?" He gestured for her to hold the knife out. "A blade is intimate. It requires you to be close enough to see the light fade from your enemy's eyes. It requires you to be in the space where you were once most vulnerable." Gloria's hands trembled. "I can't do this. I'm not a killer." "You are a woman who has been systematically erased," he countered, moving with an unnerving grace that made him look like a phantom. "You are not learning to kill. You are learning to exist. If you cannot defend your own borders, someone will always be there to annex them." He moved without warning, a blur of motion. Before she could process the shift in his weight, he had closed the distance, his hand clamped over her wrist, pinning the practice knife against his own chest. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could see the flecks of gold in his obsidian eyes, the absolute lack of hesitation in his stance. "Don't think," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her skin. "Thinking is for the people who are already dead. When you are under threat, your brain will try to bargain. It will try to offer excuses. Your body must know what to do before your mind even names the danger." He released her, circling back. Again. For the next 4 hours, the world ceased to exist. There was no Edward, no penthouse, no memory of a life before the pocket dial. There was only the weight of the steel in her hand and the rhythmic intensity of Jae-Hyuk's instruction. He didn't treat her like a lady to be protected. He treated her like a blade to be sharpened. He struck at her, parried her clumsy lunges, and forced her to close the gaps she had spent a lifetime keeping open. When she stumbled, he caught her, not with softness, but with a firm, corrective grip that snapped her back into focus. "You are still hesitating," he said, his voice dropping into a register that made her pulse leap. "You are waiting for permission to be dangerous. You don't need it. The moment you chose to stay, you granted it to yourself." By the time she finally collapsed onto the rubberized floor, every muscle in her body was screaming. Her shirt was soaked, and her hands were raw. She looked up to find Jae-Hyuk watching her, a towel in his hand. He knelt beside her, his movements stripped of their usual cold reserve. He reached out, taking the knife from her limp fingers and setting it aside. "You're learning," he said, his thumb brushing a smear of grime from her cheek, with a touch that felt startlingly human. "You have the capacity for violence, Gloria. You always did. You were just waiting for a reason to let out." Gloria looked at the knife lying on the floor, then at the man who had turned her sanctuary into a crucible. She realized with a jolt of clarity that she had finally stopped trembling. The fear wasn't gone, but it had been reorganized, compressed into a weapon. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked, her voice steady. "To turn me into someone who can look at a threat and not blink?" Jae-Hyuk stood up, offering her a hand. "I wanted to ensure that you would never again be someone else's masterpiece. I wanted you to be the architect of your own survival." He pulled her to her feet, his grip lingering for a second too long. "And tomorrow we begin the final phase." The gala was the city's most anticipated event of the season, a glittering masquerade where reputations were polished like silver and secrets were buried under layers of champagne and small talk. For Gloria, it was a final, inevitable stage of her transition. She stood in the center of her dressing room, the silence of the penthouse feeling heavier than usual. Jae-Hyuk was waiting for her in the hallway, his presence a silent promise of the chaos to come. On the chaise lounge before her lay a garment that looked less like couture and more like a tactical decision. It was a floor-length gown of deep arterial crimson, the fabric so fluid it seemed to ripple like blood on water. It clung to her frame with a terrifying, structured precision, leaving her shoulders exposed and her back bare, save for thin, silk straps that crossed like a harness. As she pulled it on, she felt the subtle weight of it, a secret pocket stitched into the interior of the thigh, designed to hold the slender, balanced blade she had spent weeks learning to wield. It wasn't just a dress. It was armor disguised as indulgence. It was a weapon made of silk and malice, designed to lull anyone who looked at her into a false sense of security before the steel made its mark. Gloria stepped into her heels, her posture shifting as she did. The months of instruction, the grueling hours on a mat, the cold lessons in anatomy, and the psychological stripping away of her victimhood had changed her silhouette. She moved with a liquid, deliberate grace that she hadn't possessed when she was merely Edward's wife. She looked into the vanity mirror and saw a stranger, but for the first time, it was a stranger she recognized. The bruise on her eye had long since faded, replaced by the cool, hard clarity of someone who had stared into the abyss and realized she was the one staring back. She exited the bedroom, the crimson hem of the gown trailing behind her like a whisper of intent. Jae-Hyuk was waiting by the elevator, his tuxedo charcoal black and sharp enough to cut the air. He turned as she approached, and for a fleeting, breathless second, the clinical mask he wore slipped. His gaze traced the length of her, from the defiant set of her jaw to the way the crimson silk molded to her form, and his eyes darkened with a predatory, possessive fire. "You look like an executioner," he said, his voice dropping into that low, melodic register that still made her skin prickle. "I look like a target," Gloria corrected him, her hand brushing the hidden way of the blade against her leg. Jae-Hyuk moved toward her, his gloved fingers grazing her bare shoulder with a touch that was almost possessive. "A target is something that can be hit, Gloria. A weapon is something that strikes. Tonight, Edward will try to reclaim what he thinks is his. He will come to the ballroom, thinking he is the hunter. He has no idea that he is walking into a trap set by his own past." He offered his arm, his expression hardening back into the architect's cold, impenetrable mask. "Do you remember the lesson? Don't think. Don't bargain. When he approaches, you become the ending of his story." "I remember," she replied, her voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of fear. They entered the elevator, the doors sliding shut to seal them into the mirrored box. As the lift began its descent, Gloria watched their reflections. Two shadows standing in the heart of the machine, a Mafia king and the woman he had forged into a blade. The descent felt like a slow drop into the throat of the beast. Edward was waiting at the gala, armed with his desperation and his ruined life, unaware that the woman he had tried to break was coming to finish the job. She took a deep breath, the silk of the gown rustling like dry leaves against the steel hidden beneath, and prepared to play the role she had been born to execute. The ballroom was a sea of crystal and muted conversation, a high society aquarium where the sharks wore tuxedos and the prey wore diamonds. Gloria moved through the crowd on Jae-Hyuk's arm, a drop of blood-red silk against the sterile white and gold of the venue. She felt every gaze, every hushed whisper of recognition, but she didn't flinch. She was no longer the woman who lived in the fear of a slamming door. She was the architect of her own final act. Then she saw him. Edward was standing near the terrace, looking gaunt and desperate, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's hunger. When he locked eyes with Gloria, his entire posture stiffened. The sight of her, draped in wealth, standing beside the most feared man in the city, seemed to snap something inside him. He didn't wait for her to approach. He moved through the crowd, shoving past waitstaff and socialites alike, his face twisted into a mask of righteous, broken fury. Jae-Hyuk felt the shift in Gloria's arm, a subtle tension that signaled the hunt had begun. He didn't need to speak. He simply stepped back, melting into the shadows of the pillars, leaving the space open for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. "Gloria," Edward hissed as he reached her, his voice a ragged edge. "You think you're safe with him? You're just another trophy in his gallery." Gloria didn't look at him with fear. She looked at him with the chilling, detached curiosity of an architect examining a failed foundation. "You built your life on the assumption that I had nowhere to run. Edward, you forgot that you were the one who taught me how to find the exit. I made you," he snarled, his hand darting out to grab her wrist. It was a final mistake of his life. Before his fingers could even graze the silk of her sleeve, Gloria moved. It wasn't a panic struggle. It was a fluid, practiced redirection of force. She stepped inside his guard, her movement a blur of crimson and steel. With a single, brutal motion, she caught his hand, and as she twisted, she pressed her knee into his midsection. As he doubled over, his breath hitching in a wheeze of surprise, Gloria reached into the hidden seam of her gown. The blade caught the light of the chandelier for a fraction of a second, a thin, silver spark of justice, before she brought it up, not to strike, but to press the cold point firmly against the soft tissue of his throat. The room seemed to inhale. The music faltered. Edward froze, his eyes widening as he stared into the face of a woman he no longer recognized. "You don't get to own me," she whispered, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom like a cold wind. "And you don't get to burn my history. You are finished. Edward, the man who had a badge, the man who had a wife, the man who had a reputation. He ended the moment you decided to break what you couldn't control." She didn't need to kill him. Watching the light of arrogance drain from his eyes, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man realizing he was prey, was far more satisfying. She stepped back, sheathing the blade into the fabric of her gown with a deliberate, calm motion, as security began to swarm, not for her, but for the broken man collapsing on the floor. Gloria turned her back on him. She walked toward the terrace, where Jae-Hyuk stood waiting. The crowd parted for her, not out of deference to him, but out of sudden, newfound fear of her. Jae-Hyuk caught her hand as she reached him, his eyes burning with intensity that transcended mere obsession. He led her out into the cool, rain-slicked air of the balcony. Below them, the city pulsed like a heartbeat, a vast machine he controlled and that she now understood. "You are done," he said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. He reached into his jacket, producing a small velvet box. He didn't open it with a question. He opened it as a statement. Inside, a black diamond ring, surrounded by blood-red stones, caught the neon glow of the skyline. "I don't offer you safety, Gloria," he said, the ring glinting between his fingers. "I offer you the empire you were always meant to help me rule. I offer you vengeance against everyone who doubted you, and the devotion of a man who has been waiting 5 years to see you become exactly who you are today." Gloria looked at the ring, then back at the man who had dismantled her life to rebuild it in his own image. She realized she would never be free in the way she once dreamed of, but she was finally terrifyingly powerful. She held out her hand, the crimson silk of her sleeve sliding back to reveal the steady, unwavering strength of her wrist. "Then let's begin," she said, as he slid the ring onto her finger. She knew the victim was gone, and the queen had finally taken her seat.